You think you know someone, but the depths of their deceit can drown a family. Those ominous words kept echoing in my mind as I stared at the bank statements laid out before me. Page after page documented a steady stream of withdrawals from our family's savings account. Thousands upon thousands of dollars vanished into thin air. My heart pounded as I scoured the records, frantically searching for an explanation. At first, I feared the worst, that my husband of 30 years, Richard, had been unfaithful not just emotionally but financially as well. We'd weathered our share of storms but always emerged united on the other side. This, however, felt like a tidal wave crashing against the foundation of everything we'd built. I confronted him that evening, printouts in hand, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Richard, we need to talk. What's going on with the money?" He furrowed his brow in confusion, taking the statements from my trembling hands. "What are you talking about? What money?" As his eyes rapidly scanned the documents, I could see the truth dawn on his face. A sickening realization that this deceit ran deeper than either of us could have imagined. We were the victims of an inside job. Richard slammed his fist on the table. "That lying little weasel! It was Brant, I'm sure of it." Brant, my own son, the one I'd nurtured from a helpless infant to a grown man of 28. It couldn't be. Could it? He wouldn't. I started, but the words caught in my throat. Of course he would. He'd been blindly devoted to his wife Cora ever since they'd met 3 years ago. If anyone could manipulate him into betraying his own family, it was that conniving viper. Richard's jaw clenched. "I'm calling him, right now." "No, wait." I grabbed his arm, my mind racing. If we confront him directly, he'll just deny everything. We need proof first. As painful as it was to admit, my own flesh and blood had potentially been turned against me. But I refused to let this devastate our family without a fight. Over the next few days, I meticulously combed through every statement, receipt, and online record. The evidence was damning. Money siphoned into accounts linked to shell companies and real estate purchases under assumed names. But for what purpose? Then it hit me. The old saying about lies building upon lies rang true. Brant had told us Cora's startup needed another round of investment. I'd had my doubts about the viability of her business, but I trusted my son's judgment. How could I have been so blind? With a few keystrokes, I uncovered a horrifying truth. Luxury clothing, high-end vacations, a brand-new Mercedes. Cora's startup was funding her wildly extravagant lifestyle, and she'd ensnared Brant in a web of deception to drain us dry. Hot tears stung my eyes as I pieced together the sordid puzzle. My own daughter-in-law had betrayed our family's trust in the cruelest way imaginable, robbing us financially to bankroll her greed. But she was sadly mistaken if she thought I would let her get away with it. This was war, and I would fight to protect what mattered most, my family. No more Mrs. Nice Mom. The velvet gloves were coming off. It was time to stop playing defensive and go on the attack. I picked up the phone and dialed the only person I could trust, my younger daughter, Jules. "Jules, honey? We need to talk." I could hear the shock in Jules's voice through the phone. "Mom, what's going on? You sound upset." "It's your brother," I said, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "He's been stealing from us. Thousands of dollars siphoned out of our savings account." There was a pause as Jules processed this. "Brant? But why would he do that?" "It's that lying snake, Cora. She's been manipulating him, making him believe her made-up startup needs more investments. But it's all a sham. She's using our money to fund her lavish lifestyle." "That bitch!" Jules' anger was palpable. I never trusted her snake eyes from the moment Brant brought her home. I filled her in on the evidence I'd uncovered, the bank records, the shell companies, the luxury purchases, all linked back to Cora's scheme. By the time I finished, Jules was seething. "We need to confront them. Put an end to this once and for all." "I already tried talking to Brant," I admitted reluctantly. "He's completely under Cora's spell. She has him wrapped around her little finger." "Then we go over his head," Jules stated firmly. "Call a family meeting. You, me, Dad, and that conniving little gold digger. Force them to face the truth head on." I took a deep breath, considering my options. As much as I hated to admit it, Jules was right. We had to take the fight directly to Cora. "All right, I'll set it up for this weekend. Just prepare yourself, sweetheart. It's going to get ugly." 2 days later, we were all seated in the living room. a tension-filled tableau of shattered trust. Brant and Cora looked almost comically out of place amidst the frayed upholstery and well-worn furnishings, with Cora absurdly decked out in designer labels. "What's this all about?" Brant asked, shifting nervously as his gaze bounced between me and his father's stony expressions. I wasted no time with preambles, letting the evidence speak for itself, as I laid out the bank statements and incriminating receipts on the coffee table. "Care to explain this, Brant?" His eyes went wide as he scanned the documents. I don't understand. Where did you get these?" "From your bank statements, the ones you've been so desperately trying to hide," Richard growled. "Stealing from your own family to bankroll this Jezebel's spending habits," Cora gasped in mock offense. "How dare you? Brant has been investing in my company, that's all." "Save it, you lying grifter." Jules jumped in, her voice dripping with disdain. "We know all about your little Ponzi scheme and your company that doesn't actually exist." Brant's head whipped towards Cora, his expression a maelstrom of hurt and anger. "Cora, please tell me it's not true. What have you done?" For a moment, I actually felt a pang of sympathy for the woman as the mask slipped, revealing her true ugly nature. A cruel, calculating smirk twisted her lips. "Of course it's true, you naive fool," she hissed at my son. "Did you really think a man with such modest means could satisfy me? This was the only way to maintain the lifestyle I deserve." My heart broke for Brant as the crushing realization hit him. The woman he loved was nothing more than a remorseless con artist. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, only a choked sound of anguish. "Get out!" The words burst from me like venom. "Get out of my house and stay away from my family. You're a despicable, selfish monster, Cora, and you're never going to leech off us again." If looks could kill, her venomous glare would have struck me dead on the spot. But I didn't flinch, locking eyes with the vile creature who had shattered my son's heart and betrayed our family's trust. "This isn't over," she spat, snatching up her designer purse. "You'll regret crossing me." With that, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. An uneasy silence hung over the room in the aftermath of her explosive exit. Brant buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I longed to comfort my son, but he needed to navigate this anguish on his own. Sometimes the harsh truths in life are the only wake-up calls that can set you back on the right path. This was just the opening salvo in what was sure to be an ugly war. But I took solace in one certainty. Cora's reign of deception over my family had finally been broken. Now it was time to make her pay. In the days following Cora's explosive exit, an uneasy calm settled over the house. Brant had locked himself away, emerging only for brief meals before retreating to his bedroom sanctuary of solitude and shame. I ached to comfort him, but my husband warned me to give him space. "He needs to work through this himself," Richard said gruffly. "Coddling him will only enable his weakness." As much as it pained me, I knew Richard was right. Tough love was the only antidote to Cora's poisonous manipulation. So I focused my energies elsewhere, gathering ammunition for the inevitable war that Viper had promised. I spent hours hunched over the computer, stitching together the insidious trail of Cora's tangled web. Fake business plans, forged investment prospectuses, backdated contracts, all designed to dupe my poor son into draining our assets to fund her rapacious greed. My fingers trembled with rage as I compiled the evidence, but I refused to let anger cloud my judgment. This had to be an airtight case. Jules proved to be an invaluable ally, using her social media skills to plumb the depths of Cora's sullied past. It turned out my son's wife had a well-traveled trail of ruined lives scattered across multiple states and ex-husbands. "This one's a real piece of work," Jules reported grimly, forwarding me a fresh dossier on Cora's sordid history, from fraud convictions to whispers of corporate espionage. "She's not just a gold digger, Mom. She's a full-on professional con artist." The more I uncovered about this vile succubus, the more my protective fury burned like an inferno. How dare this hecatomb of human debris inflict such devastation on my family? On my son? There would be a reckoning, make no mistake. One afternoon, lost in my efforts to trace a series of shell company transactions, the doorbell rang. I frowned, not expecting anyone, and peered through the viewfinder to see a stunning brunette standing on the porch. I opened the door a crack. "Yes, can I help you? Mrs. Harmon?" The woman smiled, her teeth dazzling. "I'm Trina, Cora's younger sister. I was hoping we could talk. I stared at her blankly for a moment, then scoffed. I want nothing to do with anyone from that family of vipers. Trina held up her hands pleadingly. Please, just give me a minute. I had no idea what Cora was up to, but I want to make things right. Something in her eyes suggested sincerity, so against my better judgment, I stepped back and let her enter. As I led her to the living room, she was already talking a mile a minute. I always knew Cora was troubled, but I never imagined she could stoop this low. When she told me what happened, I was horrified. Betraying her own husband's family like that? It's unforgivable. Trina whirled on me, her features contorted with remorse. Mrs. Harmon, you have to believe me. If I'd known about her scheme, I would have stopped her myself. Cora and we didn't exactly have the most stable upbringing, but that's no excuse for her behavior. I regarded her warily. Then why are you here? It's a little late for apologies, don't you think? Trina took a deep breath. Because I want to help make this right. Cora has burned me too many times with her lies and manipulations. It's time she finally faced real consequences for her actions. She reached into her purse and withdrew a slim manila folder, handing it to me. In here are copies of records from her last 3 marriages, proof of the financial deception, documents she tried to have sealed as part of those divorce settlements. I'm hoping it can help your case against her. I opened the folder, scanning the pages with a mixture of disgust and grim satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of damning evidence I needed. Why give this to me? I asked, eyeing her suspiciously. What's in it for you? Trina shrugged. Let's just say Cora took enough from me growing up. I want to make sure she can't do that to anyone else ever again. I considered her offer carefully. While I was loath to trust anyone from Cora's poisonous extended family, I couldn't deny that these were the cold, hard facts we needed to bury that vile charlatan for good. And if this Trina was willing to betray her own flesh and blood in the name of justice, well, perhaps we had an unlikely ally in our battle. All right, I said at last, holding her gaze. I'll take whatever you've got on that monster. It's time we put an end to Cora's reign of terror once and for all. The die was cast. The war had begun in earnest. With Trina's damning evidence providing new ammunition, I felt a steadier sense of resolve. For too long, Cora had held all the cards through her web of lies and deception. But now, finally, the veil was lifting to reveal her true monstrosity. Of course, I had no illusions that this battle would be easily won. That conniving viper had already made it abundantly clear she wouldn't go down without an ugly fight. I braced myself for further retaliation as I waited for the next explosive grenade to be lobbed into our lives. It came sooner than expected in the form of my daughter Jules, who burst through the front door looking equal parts distraught and furious. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," she said through gritted teeth, thrusting her phone into my hands. There on the screen was unmistakable evidence of Cora in a very compromising situation, draped across some faceless man's lap in a shadowy bar, their bodies intertwined in a way that left no doubt as to their intimacy. My stomach turned as I studied the incriminating photos. So this was how the treacherous snake chose to sink her fangs into my family once more, by attacking us from the inside. Did she truly have no limit to her depravity? "Where did you get these?" I asked quietly, already suspecting the answer. "From that worm Brant," Jules spat, her voice crackling with fury. "He sent them to Aiden first, blubbering about Cora being unfaithful and wanting to take her to court, like he's the injured party here." I sighed heavily. Of course. My poor blinded son still couldn't see the bigger picture through the haze of his ruined dreams. "He has no idea, does he?" I murmured. "That she's just twisting the knife yet again by trying to make him feel like the victim." Jules scoffed bitterly. "You mean like she's been doing this whole time, stringing him along as her pathetic puppet while she bleeds us dry to fuel her selfish desires?" "I should have seen this coming," I admitted, shaking my head slowly. "Cora is far too much of a narcissist to simply slink away after being exposed. She has to maintain control of the story at any cost." "Well, it's not going to work this time." Jules's eyes burned with determination. "We have all the evidence we need to bury that toxic leech once and for all, and we have an inside man working on our side now." I raised an eyebrow at that. "You've spoken to Aiden?" A small smile played across my daughter's lips, the first I'd seen in weeks. He's already pulling some legal favors, gathering ammunition for when we finally take that witch to court. Her twisted little scheme doesn't have a prayer once he's through. My heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. Thank heavens Jules had chosen a good, ethical man like Aiden to share her life with. His integrity and legal contacts would prove to be indispensable weapons. Good. We're going to need all the help we can get, sweetheart, because this war is about to escalate in ways we can't even imagine. Those words proved prophetic just days later when a certified letter arrived, a bombshell summons from Cora's attorneys. She was petitioning for divorce from Brant on the grounds of emotional anguish and infidelity. Her legal team was already painting her as the victim to disguise her own despicable transgressions. I could only imagine the fictitious horrors that vile succubus had concocted to vilify my son in the court's eyes. I burned with outrage at the injustice of it all. But that paled in comparison to the fury that consumed me when I read the final lines, a bald-faced demand that the matrimonial assets be split 60-40 in Cora's favor as compensation. Over my dead body, I seethed, crumpling the damning document in my fist. That grasping serpent has finally overplayed her hand. If she thinks we're going to simply hand over our life's earnings as a reward for her depraved treachery, she's utterly deluded. The gauntlet had been thrown down in the most disrespectful manner imaginable. So be it. I would match Cora's venom with a fury of my own, stopping at nothing to decimate her vile ambitions and restore dignity to my family. Steeling my nerves, I reached for my phone and dialed the one number that could help turn this situation to our advantage. Aiden? It's Delia. We need to have a serious discussion about Cora's twisted divorce filing. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife as we assembled in Aiden's cramped office downtown. My son Brant looked utterly bewildered at finding himself on the opposite side of the legal firing line from his own family. I don't understand why we're doing this, he mumbled, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Cora's the one who conned and deceived you into draining our family's life savings to fund her greed, I interjected sharply. Yes, we're all quite aware of that by now, Brant. The hurt look on his face twisted like a knife in my heart, but I refused to show any outward signs of weakness. Not when we were finally taking the battle directly to that vile succubus. Jules squeezed his arm consolingly. We're doing this for your own good, little brother, to protect you from being taken advantage of any further. Brant opened his mouth to protest, but Aiden cleared his throat commandingly. All eyes turned to my future son-in-law as he straightened the crisp collar of his shirt, every inch the image of a formidable legal professional ready for battle. All right, let's get started. I've gone through Cora's divorce petition with a fine-toothed comb, and as expected, it's a novel's worth of utter fiction designed to paint her as the victim. He rifled through a thick manila folder. Emotional anguish, spousal abandonment, criminal allegations against Brant, you name it, she's thrown it in as a salacious accusation. My jaw clenched as Aiden listed off the ruthless character assassinations Cora had leveled at my son. As if her serial betrayals and systematic looting of our accounts weren't injurious enough. That's a bold strategy, given the evidence stacked against her, Jules remarked darkly. Aiden nodded grimly. She's going for a shock and awe campaign, burying us in so many wild fabrications that she's betting we'll get overwhelmed trying to counter them all. But, he lifted his chin defiantly, I've got a few moves of my own to counter. With a series of deft keystrokes, he pulled up a multimedia presentation that quickly had me squirming in discomfort. There, broadcast in vivid high definition, were the incriminating photographs of Cora's indiscretions, leaving no doubt as to her chronic infidelity throughout her marriage to Brant. We hit her with a ruthless blitz of our own evidence right out of the gate, Aiden declared. Have the Jezebel explain away these images while we follow up with documentation of her embezzlement, financial fraud, even criminal charges from her shady past. I could feel the palpable tension radiating off Brant as he absorbed the full extent of Cora's duplicity, immortalized in those damning photos. His fists clenched, and for a moment I feared he might become physically ill. You knew about this? His voice cracked with a ruined mixture of accusation and betrayal. You all knew she was cheating on me this whole time? An uncomfortable silence fell over the room as Jules, Aiden, and I exchanged weighted looks. I was the one who finally found the words to respond. We knew that she was willing to go to monstrous lengths to control you through deceit and manipulation, I said carefully. We were waiting for the most strategic opportunity to counter her. The disappointment etched across Brant's features cut me to the core. As a mother, I had failed in so many ways to protect him from this devastation, but there would be time later to rebuild our fractured family. First, we had to slay the demon responsible for this misery. "I'm so sorry, son," I murmured, placing a hand on his arm. "But I promise you, Cora's reign of terror over this family ends today. We're going to make her pay for every last crooked scheme and underhanded betrayal." Brant regarded me hollowly for a long moment before giving a small, resolute nod. The fight had finally burned away his naive illusions. Now he was ready to embrace the harsh reality of the battle that loomed before us. "All right," he said, his voice regaining its steely edge. "Let's take down the bitch, once and for all." Emboldened by my son's words, I turned to Aiden with a feral smile. "You heard him. It's time to unleash the Kraken." The courthouse was pandemonium the day our opening legal salvo against Cora detonated. Aiden had strategically timed the release of our incriminating evidence to catch the opposition completely flat-footed. I'll never forget the look of shock and panic that contorted Cora's features as high-definition video clips aired of her in flagrante delicto with multiple male companions. Aiden's team had spared no detail in capturing the extent of her wanton infidelities. "You lying, cheating whore!" Brant erupted from our side of the gallery, his face twisted with anguish and rage. "Is this why you've been bleeding me dry all these years? To support your stable of boy toys?" I winced at my son's uncharacteristic outburst, but couldn't fault his fury. Cora had single-handedly shattered his trusting, loving heart into pieces. She deserved every venom-laced barb that Brant could muster. But predictably, the serpent had her own counterstrike primed, rising to her feet with a look of perfectly cultivated umbrage. "How dare you subject me to such humiliating and falsified accusations?" She swept a theatrical hand towards the incriminating videos, now frozen on images of her in extremis. These distasteful smear tactics might make for good courtroom theatrics, but they simply underscore the depravity and abuse I've been forced to endure throughout our sham of a marriage. A gasp rippled through the spectator gallery as Cora pulled off her next move. Makeup experts strategically disguising her flawless features under a mask of brutal injuries. With a few deft touches branding around one eye and garish scars on her cheeks, the venomous viper had reinvented herself as the innocent victim of spousal abuse. I felt a surge of nausea at the sheer, malicious audacity of her ploy. Brant Harmon is a dangerous, unstable man, a monster who carries the familial stamp of unrepressed violence. She jabbed an accusing finger towards our side of the court. "Judge, you see before you today the tragic effect his sadistic tantrums have inflicted upon me, leaving me broken, destitute, and in constant fear for my very life." As her honeyed lies flowed like poisonous nectar, I could see a palpable shift among some of the jurors. A few looked taken aback, possibly even swayed by the dramatized atrocities she presented. I gritted my teeth in outrage, my fury compounded at seeing my sweet-natured Brant portrayed as some kind of brutish monster. These were exactly the sort of underhanded tactics we had warned him to expect from Cora's devious legal team. But Aiden had assured us he was prepared with a decisive counterstrike, and true to his word, he smoothly called up images of Cora's financial transactions over the past 3 years. In meticulous detail, line after line of frivolous expenditures were laid bare. Designer clothing splurges, lavish international vacations, even the purchase of a top-of-the-line luxury sedan. If Miss Cora Reynolds was truly the tragic, impoverished victim of spousal abuse she so dramatically portrays, where precisely did the funds for these excessive indulgences derive? Aiden's voice carried a razor edge as he paced before the jurors. "No, I'd posit the resources fueling such a rapaciously indulgent lifestyle originated from a far more nefarious source." His finger stabbed accusingly at the opposing counsel's table. Namely, the systematic looting of her husband Brant Harmon's family assets under the guise of funding a fictional startup company to the ruinous tune of nearly $500,000. The shouting and acrimony that erupted was nothing short of biblical, as the dueling legal teams resorted to out-and-out bedlam in the court. Vicious accusations were hurled back and forth, as Cora predictably played her final card, crocodile tears of feigned distress, collapsing into wailing hysterics over the injustice of Aiden's allegations against her character. As the judge finally restored order by calling a recess, I caught Aiden's eye across the gallery. He offered a grim nod. The first salvo had hit its mark. Now the real battle would begin in earnest. I steeled myself, drawing Jules and Brant close as I prepared for the inevitable backlash heading our way. Because there was no way that vile succubus would go down without unsheathing every last weapon in her diabolical arsenal. "Stay strong, you two," I murmured as the towering oak doors boomed shut behind us. "The war has only just begun." The ensuing weeks were some of the most grueling of my life as the legal war raged on. True to form, Cora unleashed the full force of her depraved powers, filing motion after motion in an attempt to bury us under an avalanche of paperwork. Aiden assured us this was merely standard legal gamesmanship to buy time, but I could see the strain it placed on our entire family. Brant grew increasingly haggard, his usual youthful glow sapped by the stress of confronting his wife's betrayal on such a public stage. More than once, I found him holed up in his old childhood bedroom, knuckles bloodied from pounding the walls in anguished frustration. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Mom," he confided in me during one particularly dark moment. "Having every secret, every private failing dissected and crucified before the world, it's torture." I pulled him into a fierce embrace, blinking back my own tears. "I know, my sweet boy. Believe me, if there was any other way, I would have taken it. But that woman left us no other choice." His shoulders shook with silent sobs against me. "Why, Mom? Why did she have to be so evil and cruel? I loved her with everything I had." My heart broke anew for all his stolen hopes and innocence, so ruthlessly crushed by that vile serpent's avarice. What sort of waking nightmare had she subjected my caring, sensitive son to in the name of fueling her own selfish desires? Thankfully, the relentless Sturm und Drang of Cora's legal blitzkrieg was nearing its inevitable crescendo. Her myriad motions for dismissals and mistrials were rapidly getting batted down by the no-nonsense judge. With options dwindling, she and her unscrupulous legal team were forced back on the defensive. It was during this window of respite that Aiden and his investigators finally managed to meticulously reassemble every damning thread of Cora's intricate con. What they uncovered was a masterclass study in sociopathic deception, a decade's worth of falsified documents, fake business identities, even forged educational transcripts forming the bedrock of her sham life story. "She's a prodigy," Aiden grimly relayed over glasses of scotch one night, "an honest-to-God pathological savant when it comes to interweaving lies and writes them into credible realities." He shoved a thick dossier across the table, his mouth twisted into a scowl of disgust. Multiple false identities, a complete trail of invented lives dating back to her late teens. It's as if her very existence has been a carefully constructed script designed to facilitate her cons and swindles. I flipped through the damning contents with rising revulsion. Here was a complete psychological profile of the monster who had torn my family asunder. A narcissistic, Machiavellian parasite capable of calculations depravity, all in pursuit of self-gratification. No guilt, no remorse, no core of human decency to be found. "My God," I whispered, closing the file as if it burned me. "She really is nothing more than a vile sociopath." In the end, it was the sheer, incontrovertible weight of the evidence that proved to be Cora's undoing. Her house of lies, so meticulously constructed over decades of malicious cunning, came crashing down in spectacular fashion over the span of just a few short days. I'll never forget the triumphant night the jury's verdict was read. Guilty on all counts of fraud, embezzlement, criminal conspiracy. The litany of felonies washed over me in a tidal wave of vindication. Brant watched in stupefied silence as his wife was led away in shackles, still protesting her innocence with that same mask of deluded self-entitlement. Jules and I locked eyes over the celebratory chaos, exchanging looks of grim satisfaction. At long last, justice had been served, both for our family's financial devastation and the emotional turmoil inflicted by that vicious, soulless succubus. In the coming days, the restitution orders began raining down like a final penance for Cora's depravities. In addition to multi-year prison sentences for her litany of crimes, she was compelled to forfeit every last ill-gotten asset to the plaintiffs she had so ruthlessly victimized. Properties, bank accounts, that ostentatious Mercedes she so loved to flaunt. All of it clawed back from the talons of her greed to be redistributed among the families she had bled dry over her decades of con artistry. For our family, it was a potentially transformative reversal from the financial devastation Cora had wrought, though the emotional wounds would take far longer to heal. As I watched the federal marshals hauling off truckload after truckload of Cora's seized belongings, I felt an uncharacteristic pang of pity for the sociopathic scourge. Because in that moment, it struck me that everything she had devoted her miserable existence to attaining, the wealth, the status, the delusions of finer belongings, was all little more than a gilded cage trapping her soulless being. And I realized that in the end, there was ultimately no greater punishment than leaving a malignant narcissist like Cora Jean Reynolds alone to wither within the squalid, hollow confines of her own wretched psyche. In the aftermath of Cora's well-deserved downfall, an uneasy sense of calm gradually settled over our family. It was almost disorientating at first, having grown so accustomed to the relentless churn of battles, hearings, and legal machinations infiltrating every waking moment. Now, silence. Of course, one could hardly call the haunted emptiness reflected in Brant's eyes as peaceful. My poor son had been so utterly shattered by the monstrosity of Cora's deceptions that some days he could barely summon the energy to get out of bed. I knew the road to recovery would be long and arduous for him. Having the unconditional loving trust in another human being so brutally eviscerated leaves psychic scars that fester for a lifetime. Brant was likely carrying trauma that would take years of counseling to fully unpack and process, but I also knew that with time and the support of his family, he would eventually find his way back from the nightmare that vile succubus had dragged him through. My son's kind, gentle spirit may have been battered, but it could never be extinguished permanently. Not while I still drew breath to nurture its renewal. The first real glimmer of light came a few months after the final restitution orders were handed down against Cora. Jules and Aiden had finally set a wedding date, and the impending celebration of new beginnings seemed to rekindle a tiny spark of life behind Brant's deadened eyes. "You'll stand up there with me that day, right, little brother?" Jules had asked him over Sunday breakfast one morning, squeezing his hand affectionately. "Be one of Aiden's groomsmen?" For a long, horrible moment, I didn't think Brant had even registered her words. Then finally, he looked up and managed the faintest of smiles, a barely perceptible nod. Yeah, of course, I'd be honored." In that simple exchange, a major turning point had been reached. New horizons of healing lay ahead. As the months marched on towards Jules and Aiden's big day, other signs of renewal sprouted among the wreckage Cora had left behind. Legal disbursements finally began granting our family access to the seized assets, liquidating properties, investments, and recouping that $500,000 she had so insidiously pilfered from our accounts. The restitution wouldn't make us wealthy by any means, but it did provide a solid bedrock of financial security upon which we could start building anew. Ever pragmatic, I opted to take a portion of the recouped funds to pay off the mortgage on our family home. This little sanctuary that Cora had so ruthlessly sought to strip away would now be ours free and clear in perpetuity. I wanted to ensure my children and any grandchildren to come would always have a solid foundation and sense of belonging in this world. The real revelation, and the first genuine smile I'd seen from my son in ages, came when Aiden presented him with the marshal's final disposition manifest on Cora's seized assets. "I figure this last remaining property title is rightfully yours, man," he said, sliding the document towards Brant. "Fair compensation for the psychological torture she put you through." I watched in surprise as Brant's eyes lit up, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced over the title. "You're giving me her Mercedes?" he asked in a hushed tone. "Seriously?" Aiden clapped him on the shoulder with a conspiratorial wink. "Let's just consider it the first step towards you leaving that poison behind and reclaiming your future, buddy. After so many months of darkness, The sight of my son's face radiating with that unbridled spark of youthful enthusiasm was enough to finally crumble the walls around my own heart. I excused myself from the room to weep tears of catharsis, muttering silent praises of gratitude that we had survived Cora's malice intact. The biggest healing milestone was yet to come on Jules and Aiden's wedding day. A beautiful late summer affair under a canopy of old-growth trees, the whole family gathered to rejoice in new bonds of love being forged. I beamed with pride watching my son walk the aisle as a member of the bridal party, his jaw set with determination, his eyes clear and focused on the future. As the newly wedded couple shared their first dance amidst a shower of rose petals, I slipped an arm around Brant's shoulders. He startled at first, then relaxed into my embrace with a contented sigh. "I'm so proud of you for making it through the darkness, my sweet boy," I murmured. "Our family is whole again, and nothing will ever tear us asunder like that again." Brant was silent for a long moment, his gaze transfixed on the radiant young couple before us. Finally, he found the words, simple, but filled with newfound conviction. "I know, Mom, and I swear on my life, I'll never let us be destroyed by evil and lies again either." As the opening notes of the couple's first dance struck up, I smiled and gave my son's hand a reassuring squeeze. After so many storms had threatened to break us, the rainbow of redemption shone brilliantly on our path ahead, a trails paved with forgiveness, newfound strength, and the eternal, unbreakable bonds of family.
I never imagined how my life would pan out. This is my tale, and my name is Anna. I was raised by kind farmers who instilled in me the importance of diligence and hard work. We had been taking care of the crops and livestock before the sun came up since I could walk. Back then, life was easy. After going to school, I would return home and assist on the farm. The purpose of weekends was to catch up on household tasks and spend time with family. I was content with the knowledge I had. However, following my high school graduation, everything changed. Thank God, my parents didn't want me to grow up on a farm. "Anna, we've been talking," my dad stated one evening during supper. "I agree with your mother that you ought to attend college." And my universe expanded instantly after that. After packing my things, I relocated to the city, which was like a whole new planet from my previous surroundings. It was an experience going to college. The individuals were the ones who truly opened my eyes, even though the lessons were intriguing. Students arrived from a variety of backgrounds, and I was surprised by their aspirations and intentions. And then in my third year, I met Scott. He was much different from the country guys back home. He was charming and self-assured. Scott appeared to have a clear vision of his ideal existence. "Life is too short to work all the time," he would remark as he lay on the library's lawn. "We should enjoy it while we're young." I became engrossed. Instead of life being a work list, he made it look like an adventure. After we started dating, we were discussing marriage before I realized it. My folks were wary when I informed them. They were eager to meet and get to know the man who had captured my heart, Scott. My dad remarked, "He seems nice enough, but there's something I can't put my finger on." Following Scott's first visit to the farm, "Please use caution, Anna," I dismissed his worries. What knowledge of love did my traditional father possess? Our life was going to be great because Scott was amazing. Being the generous people that they are, my parents even paid for our wedding and purchased a city apartment for us. "We wish you a successful beginning," my mother replied, her eyes moist. I gave them a strong embrace and said, "Thanks, Mom and Dad. I swear I'll bring you pride." I felt like my life was complete when Scott and I exchanged rings and vows at the altar. I had a wonderful career in the city, a spouse I believed loved me, and a promising future. I thought our marriage was going well for the first few years of it. Scott and I established a pattern since we were both city workers. However, when I go back, I can see the warning signals that things weren't as good as I had assumed. Is it really necessary for us to spend this weekend at your parents' farm? Scott would always be upset when I proposed a visit. It has a manure smell to it, and your dad always asks me to help. They're my family, Scott, and they've done so much for us. I would sigh in attempt to explain. All right, but I'm not shoving any cow poop, he would complain. I dismissed it, assuming he was simply a city lad who wasn't accustomed to living on a farm. Though I wonder now if those Sensen tasks were a warning sign. I grew up with them. I became pregnant 3 years into our marriage. My parents were ecstatic, and I was ecstatic. My mother exclaimed, "A grandchild," over the phone. "Oh, Anna, you have our deepest gratitude." Scott, though, wasn't feeling quite as thrilled. A child already. I suppose that's all right. I assumed he was just apprehensive and that he would get used to the thought of becoming a father. As usual, my parents provided me with unwavering support. They paid for our travels as well as the automobile we purchased. Though Scott seemed to take it all for granted, I was really appreciative. Obviously, they're assisting us, he would respond. Parents are expected to do that. I was immediately in love with our son Peter at the time of his birth, but Scott found it difficult. Despite his best efforts, he struggled to become a father. He used to be upset when Peter wept at night, saying, "Can't you keep that quiet?" A few of us have early shifts at work. I told myself that we were both still getting acclimated to being parents, so I forced myself to swallow my annoyance. As time passed, we continued to visit the farm whenever we could, despite Scott's growing reluctance on each visit. He would moan, "Your dad wants me to help fix the tractor again." I am not a technician. I used to see my dad and Scott working together, with my dad patiently demonstrating fixes for him as Scott clumsily fumbled with the equipment, appearing irritated. Then my parents died within a year of one another. I was devastated. I cried into Scott's shoulder. They're gone. It's unbelievable that they're truly gone. He added, "It'll be okay," and gave me an uncomfortable back pat. They did leave the property, at least. I was astonished by what he said. All Scott could think about was what we'd inherited, the farm, my family's heritage. A few months later, Scott dropped a bombshell. We should sell the farm, he said one night at dinner. We could buy a big house in the city and live like royalty. I wanted to argue, to fight for my family's legacy, but I was so tired, worn down by grief and the challenges of being a mom. Wasn't I supposed to support my husband's decisions? Okay, I said quietly, if you think it's best. And just like that, with a few signatures on some papers, my family's history was sold to the highest bidder. The money went into our joint account, and Scott was overjoyed. "We're set for life, Anna," he said, thrilled. "No more working ourselves to the bone. We can do whatever we want now." I nodded and smiled, trying to push down the emptiness I felt inside. This was what Scott wanted, and as his wife, wasn't I supposed to support him? After selling the farm, life changed. The money from the sale gave us some comfort. I'll give Scott that. We didn't have to work as hard anymore. We both cut back to part-time hours, and for a while, it felt like we were living the dream. But as time passed, I started noticing things. Scott, who had never been much of a hard worker, seemed to lose all motivation. He'd quit jobs without a second thought, always with some excuse. That boss was a jerk, he'd say, or they expected too much. I'm not a slave, you know. I tried to reason with him. Scott, we can't live off the farm money forever. We need to think about the future. He just waved me off. Relax, Anna. We're set for life. Why work ourselves to death? Meanwhile, our son Peter was growing up quickly. He finished high school, then college, and soon he was working and living on his own. I was so proud of him, but I missed having him around. One day, I was reading the newspaper when a name jumped out at me. It was an article about a successful concrete plant owned by Scott's Uncle John. "Scott," I called out, "did you see this article about your Uncle John?" Scott's face darkened. "I don't want to hear about that old tyrant," he snapped. I knew the story, at least Scott's version of it. His parents had died when he was young, leaving him in the care of his uncle. Scott always said John had been controlling, trying to force him into the family business. He never listened to what I wanted, Scott had told me years ago. It was always about what he thought was best, so I left and started my own life. Looking at Scott now, lounging in his robe at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. "Maybe it's time to make peace," I suggested gently. "It's been years, Scott. People change." Scott's reaction was instant and explosive. "Make peace with that control freak? No way. Drop it, Anna." I let it go, but the whole thing left me feeling uneasy. There was so much anger, so much resentment in Scott's words. It made me wonder what else he was holding on to, what other parts of himself he was keeping hidden. One quiet Friday afternoon, I overheard Scott on the phone. His voice was short and cold. "I'm not interested in his life, and it doesn't concern me," he said sharply before hanging up. My curiosity got the better of me. "Who was that, honey?" I asked. Scott's face showed no emotion. "Hospital. My uncle's sick. If he dies, maybe I'll finally get something out of him." I was shocked. "Scott, that's a horrible thing to say. He raised you." "Yeah, and he made my life hell," Scott snapped. "I'm not going to see him." End of story. He picked up the remote and settled back into his chair. Something broke inside me. This wasn't the man I had married. This wasn't the person I thought I knew. Without saying a word to Scott, I went to the bedroom and called Peter. "Hey, sweetie," I said when he answered. "How would you feel about meeting your great uncle?" Peter was surprised, but agreed quickly. An hour later, we walked into the hospital, my heart racing. The ICU was filled with the sound of beeping machines and soft voices. There in a bed surrounded by monitors was Scott's Uncle John. He looked small and weak, nothing like the controlling man Scott had described. When we introduced ourselves, his eyes filled with tears. "Anna, Peter," he said, his voice soft but warm. "I've wanted to meet you for so long." For the next hour, John told us his side of the story. He explained how he had taken Scott in after his parents died and raised him like his own. "I loved that boy," John said, his voice breaking. "I wanted him to have everything, carry on the family business, have a good life. But Scott had other ideas." John went on to explain that Scott didn't want the responsibility. He said he didn't want to work hard like I did, staying up at night worrying about the business. As John spoke, I felt a sinking feeling. His words painted a picture I knew all too well. "Scott demanded I sell the business," John said, shaking his head. "He wanted me to give him a monthly allowance, an apartment, a car. He said I owed him a carefree life." I glanced at Peter, and I could see the same shock on his face. "I told him that's not how life works," John continued. "I begged him to stay and learn the business, but he just got angry. He said he'd find a rich wife and never have to work again." I sat in Uncle John's hospital room, and memories from the past 12 years flooded my mind. It was like I was finally seeing the truth. Scott had never kept a job for long. He always worked part-time, called in sick, and took lots of days off. I had always thought it was because he was stressed or just a free spirit, but now I understand. He would always say, "Life is for fun, Anna. Why work so hard?" A sick feeling hit me. As I realized that Scott didn't marry me for love, he married me for my family's money, for the easy life he thought I could give him. I was just a way for him to get what he wanted, the rich wife he had promised his uncle he'd find. Tears filled my eyes as the truth sank in. Our life, our marriage, our family, it had all been built on a lie. Uncle John's weak voice pulled me from my thoughts. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I wanted to leave something for you and Peter, but I can't." "It's okay," I said, squeezing his hand. "We don't need anything." "I had plans," John continued, sounding upset. "A new project. It would have changed everything, but I ran out of time." Suddenly, John's face twisted in pain, and the machines around him started beeping urgently. A nurse rushed in. "You need to leave," she said. A few days later, the call came. Uncle John had passed away. When I told Scott, his reaction made my blood run cold. "Finally," he exclaimed, grinning. "Took the old bastard long enough." I stared at him, horrified. "Scott, he was your uncle. He raised you." Scott waved me off. Yeah. "So when's the funeral?" "Do I need to go?" In the end, Scott didn't attend the funeral. Peter and I arranged it ourselves. It was a small, dignified service that I hoped would have made Uncle John proud. While I was mourning a man I had barely known, my husband was at home celebrating, calculating his new wealth. I overheard him on the phone when I got home, saying, "The factory's got to be worth at least $30 million. Can you believe it? I'm rich." I watched Scott strut around the house, bragging about his inheritance, and felt nothing but disgust. This wasn't the man I thought I'd married. He was a stranger in my husband's skin. Then things got even worse. One evening, Scott looked at me with cold eyes and said, "Anna, you're getting kind of old for me. I think it's time for an upgrade." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Excuse me," I asked. He shrugged, not even trying to look guilty. "You heard me. I'm rich now. I can do better." Over the next few weeks, Scott's behavior spiraled out of control. He stayed out late, coming home in the early morning reeking of alcohol and perfume. More than once, I was left feeling like I had lost everything. I noticed lipstick stains on Scott's collar, and every time I confronted him, he brushed me off. "Mind your own business," he'd say. "You should be grateful I come home at all." One night, as I lay awake listening to him stumble in at 4:00 a.m., I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this. I deserved better, but more importantly, I needed to know the truth. About Scott, about the inheritance, and about the life I thought we had built together. One morning, after another night of Scott coming home at dawn, I'd had enough. "Where were you?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. Scott rubbed his bloodshot eyes and narrowed them at me. "None of your damn business, Anna. You should be grateful I even come back at all." I felt like I'd been slapped. Grateful. Is that what you think our marriage is? He ignored my question, his eyes calculating. "How much is left from your parents' inheritance? We must have some savings, right?" The sudden change of topic caught me off guard. "What, Scott? We've spent it all. The accounts are empty." His face twisted with disgust. "Empty? You've got to be kidding me." He paced the room, muttering to himself, then turned to me, his eyes cold. "Well, I guess that's it then. I'm done here. Done with you." Before I could respond, the front door opened, and Peter walked in. His eyes widened as he saw the tension in the room. Scott's demeanor shifted instantly. He forced a smile and walked over to our son. "Peter, my boy. Just the person I wanted to see. I need you to sign something for me." Scott pulled a document from his pocket and handed it to Peter. It's just a formality. You're giving up any claim to Uncle John's estate. Since there's no will, it all comes to me anyway. Peter looked confused, glancing at me for guidance. After I gave him a small nod, he signed the paper without hesitation. Scott's grin was triumphant as he grabbed the document back. Then, as if a switch had flipped, he turned to me, his voice cold and flat. "I want a divorce," he said. "I never loved you, Anna. I just put up with you for your parents' money. But now I'm rich. I don't need you anymore." His words hit me like a punch. Even though, deep down, I had suspected this, hearing it laid out so bluntly was still devastating. "I'm moving to Uncle John's house," Scott continued, already packing a suitcase. "Don't try to contact me. It's over." And just like that, he was gone. 33 years of marriage packed into a suitcase and out the door. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It felt unreal, like a bad dream. I couldn't hold it together any longer. "Mom." Peter's voice was soft, full of concern. "Mom, are you okay?" I turned to look at my son, my steady rock, and the dam broke. Tears poured down my face as Peter wrapped his arms around me. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered, holding me tight. "We'll get through this. You're strong, and you'll be okay." As I clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder, I couldn't help but be amazed at the man he had become, kind and compassionate, everything his father wasn't. Then I realized something. "You're the best thing he ever did," I whispered to Peter. "The only good thing to come out of this marriage." Peter hugged me even tighter, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, I wasn't alone. I had my son, and together, we'd face whatever came next. The weeks after Scott left were a blur of pain and disbelief. I tried to stay strong, to focus on moving forward, but it wasn't easy. Scott seemed determined to flaunt his new life right in my face. It started with his Facebook posts. Pictures of Uncle John's mansion, which was now Scott's home, filled his timeline. I tried to ignore it and focus on healing. Then the photos changed. A young woman started appearing in them. She was blonde, beautiful, and barely older than Peter. In one photo, Scott had his arm around her, both of them smiling at the camera. The caption made me feel sick. Asterisk meet my fiancée Joyce. Upgrade complete asterisk. The call started almost immediately. Friends, acquaintances, even some of Peter's old teachers reached out. "Anna, dear, is everything okay?" We saw Scott's posts. "What's going on?" I couldn't take it anymore. The humiliation, the constant reminders of Scott's betrayal. It was all too much. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I called Scott and asked to meet after speaking with a lawyer. The day of the meeting arrived, and I waited at our old favorite cafe, divorce papers in hand. Scott strolled in with Joyce on his arm. She couldn't have been more than 27, her face covered in makeup. Giggling at something, Scott whispered in her ear. Well, Scott smirked as he pulled out a chair for Joyce. "If it isn't the old ball and chain. Joyce, honey, meet Anna, the starter wife." Joyce gave me a pitying look that made my blood boil, but I kept my cool. "I have the divorce papers here," I said, sliding them across the table. "I'm not asking for much, just the house. You can keep everything else." To my surprise, Scott picked up the pen without a word. "Fine, have your little house. I've got bigger and better things now," he said, scribbling his signature on the papers. Then he turned to Joyce, his voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Now I can finally be with someone I truly love, someone worthy of me." I gathered the papers, my hands shaking a little, and walked out of the cafe. Behind me, I could hear Scott's mocking laughter, but I didn't look back. I had what I came for. The next day, I filed for divorce. As I handed the papers to the court clerk, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Life has a funny way of bringing justice when you least expect it. For me, it came in the form of a newspaper headline. Asterisk local business tycoon's empire crumbles. Nephew left with massive debt asterisk. It turned out Uncle John had taken out a huge loan just before he passed, hoping to expand his business. He had mentioned something about a new project during our hospital visit, but Peter and I hadn't understood the impact at the time. Now it all made sense. I watched from afar as Scott's new life fell apart. He sold the factory, the mansion, the cars, everything, and he still owed nearly $1 million. The icing on the cake. His young fiancée, Joyce, packed her bags and left as soon as she realized Scott wasn't the rich man she thought he was. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a bit of satisfaction. Karma had finally caught up with Scott. Then one rainy evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Scott standing there, looking nothing like the smug, wealthy man who had walked out on me months ago. He was a mess, his eyes red and desperate. "Anna," he said, his voice cracking, "I've been such a fool. I see that now. Please, can we talk?" I allowed him in against my better judgment. I listened for the next hour as Scott opened out to me. He shared with me his story of losing everything and discovering what was truly important in life. He begged, I was wrong, Anna, as he spoke. Very incorrect. But now I see, you were the one person who ever showed me genuine concern. The sole true love of my life. Then to my surprise, Scott dropped on one knee and produced a little velvet package. "Please give me another opportunity, Anna. Marry me. If we work together, we can overcome anything." I remained silent for a while. Then I did something that really startled me. I started to giggle. I laughed a little at first, but then I burst out laughing so hard that tears streamed down my face. Scott's face fell. With confusion, he said, "What's so funny?" I glanced directly at Scott once I had finally gathered my breath. "Oh, Scott, were you really expecting it to be that simple? That after discarding me and treating me like garbage, you could come crawling back when your life went apart?" With a darker expression, he got up, looking irritated. His words were, "Listen here," growling. "This is also my home. I am entitled to certain privileges." I quietly strolled up to the drawer that held the divorce paperwork, took them out, and presented his signature to him. "You don't, Scott. You gave up ownership of this house by signing. I own it. Now leave or I'll contact the police." I briefly believed he may protest, but my expression must have shown that I was sincere. He turned and rushed out, slamming the door behind him, without further word. I contacted Peter as soon as he left and told him everything. As usual, my amazing son offered assistance. "Mom, you made the right decision," he added. "I'm proud of you." I treasured those remarks more than he can ever know. Over the next few weeks, I made some significant choices. The home felt too vast for me alone, with all its memories, both happy and unpleasant. In order to purchase a comfortable apartment in a bustling district I had always adored, I sold it and used the proceeds. I feel like my life is just getting started at 62. I've been traveling, going to all the locations Scott said we would go, but we never did. I've attempted salsa dancing, joined a reading club, and taken up painting. I see Scott around town every now and again. He now has an older appearance as a result of his errors and poor decisions. Although my expectations for life were not met, guess what? Nothing would be altered by me. I'm genuinely, fully pleased being myself for the first time in a very long time. I couldn't believe what I heard when I questioned my mother-in-law, who smirked. "Why don't you just stay there forever?" While I was getting ready to return to my hometown to give birth. "I want no more of your freeloading visage." Her rude remarks hurt, but I was able to remain composed and say, "All right, take care then." I'm a 32-year-old professional named Michelle. I met Kevin 3 years ago at a party because we both loved music, and we have been together ever since. After exchanging numbers, we began spending our evenings together over drinks at the neighborhood pub, discussing anything from our favorite music to problems at work. Spending time with Kevin was always enjoyable and seemed to go very quickly. We soon got together as a relationship, and I've never been happier. We cherish spending weekends together, even if we have busy work. Imagining meeting Kevin at the end of the week motivates me to put in more effort and produce more. Our friendship has really aided my career by offering encouragement and support. We moved in together after a year of dating, taking a big step and deciding to be married. We were both serious about our future. Living together let us get to know one another better and better understand each other's quirks and routines. After a year of living together, I am more eager than ever to marry him, and I know he wants to wait for the right time to pop the question. Then, unexpectedly, Kevin asked me to a fancy restaurant for supper. Although it wasn't a particularly noteworthy event, I couldn't get rid of the idea that this may be it. I was excited and nervous at the same time when I got to the restaurant after work. I observed that he appeared much more nervous than I did when I saw him. Kevin was clearly apprehensive, but in a strange way, it eased my own worry to see him that way. I laughed quietly at his earnest yet stilted greeting. As our lunch continued, Kevin's anxiety became more apparent. He whispered my name as we were clearing our plates. "Michelle," his straight, sincere look unnerved me a little. "Michelle, you are the most amazing person, and I will always treasure you. I'm hoping you think the same of me. Will you then marry me?" He presented a ring along with some very moving comments. My reaction was happy and instinctive. Yes, I am eager for us to begin our lives together. When our engagement was officially announced, I was ecstatic. But the happiness was short-lived as life's responsibilities took over. We had to set up get-togethers with our families, get to know one another's families, and begin preparing for our wedding. It was difficult to juggle everything with our hard professions, but Kevin and I were able to find the time to carry out our ideas. My parents loved Kevin right away when I introduced him to them because of his warmth and genuineness. Their acceptance meant the world to me, and I was happy that they supported our marriage decision. But the encounter with Kevin's parents had an unanticipated twist. Kevin's mother said, rather plainly when she first met me, Kevin's fiancé, "You appear to be rather simple." Her angry remarks surprised me. Kevin interrupted me before I could reply, adding, "Mom, what are you saying?" "She's the woman I've chosen," he said in a combative tone. "I'm simply being truthful," his mother shot back. Then, in an attempt to defuse the situation, Kevin's father stepped in. "Susan, enough already. That is not appropriate." I was devastated by his mother's statements, and even though Kevin and his father tried to support me, I was unable to get past it. Kevin later expressed regret. "Michelle, I apologize for my mother. She's always been honest, perhaps overly honest." Kevin told me, shocking me with his candor, "I've never been completely comfortable with it either. So please try not to be affected by what she said. Please let me know right away if she says anything inappropriate after we are married." "I'll see to it," he really pledged. His assurance greatly allayed my concerns. Even when we first met his parents, Kevin had demonstrated a protective nature from the beginning of our relationship. But my nervousness persisted, particularly because of the impending family get-together. I couldn't help but worry that Susan, Kevin's mother, would also treat my parents disrespectfully. Kevin reassured me that he would handle things carefully, despite my worries. In addition, I had warned my parents about Susan's strong personality, which they already knew about from earlier summaries. When the family gathering day finally arrived, I was anxious for very different reasons. "Hi, I'm Kevin's father." Jack said, "It's nice to meet you," and he held out his hand to my parents. "We're Michelle's parents," my parents kindly replied, keeping the conversation lighthearted. They said hello to Jack, but Susan stayed quiet, taking a seat by herself and placing her drink order without making eye contact. "Give me her red wine, please. It appears that we will require a small amount of alcohol to spice things up," she said nonchalantly, her remark throwing a discomforting shadow over the group. My parents, stunned by Susan's blunt demeanor, were momentarily speechless. Both Jack and Kevin, clearly annoyed by Susan's behavior, quickly apologized for her rudeness. As the meal progressed, my parents and Jack hit it off, engaging in friendly conversation. Susan, focusing mainly on her meal, remained quiet initially. However, as she drank more, she began to interject rudely into the conversations. "A government job may be stable, but the pay isn't anything to brag about. Kevin's marrying into such boring people," she blurted, becoming increasingly disruptive as the evening wore on. "If they have kids, they'll probably be just as dull," Susan commented sharply, clearly crossing a line with her remarks. "That's enough," Jack interjected, his voice laden with anger. "You need to leave now." Susan left reluctantly, muttering about how she was just being honest. Jack escorted her outside and arranged for a cab to take her home. When he returned to the restaurant, he and Kevin apologized once more for Susan's behavior. I was thankful that we had reserved a private room. Susan had proven to be a greater challenge than we had anticipated. At our wedding, she was noticeably more reserved, likely due to Jack's stern warning that she must behave impeccably or face serious consequences. He had even hinted at divorce if she embarrassed them again. Thankfully, she held back her comments, and the wedding proceeded flawlessly, much to my relief. Thus, Kevin and I embarked on our married life with earnest enthusiasm. We had a wonderful relationship filled with bliss as we shared household responsibilities evenly, ensuring neither of us felt overburdened. Kevin was an excellent cook, which was a delightful bonus on days he was late from work, but still took on the role of chef. We cooked together, making our time as a happy couple even more enjoyable. Kevin made it a point to visit his family home alone as much as possible, being mindful of both Susan's and my feelings. Thanks to this, I was spared any direct snide remarks or confrontations from Susan, and I deeply appreciated Kevin's thoughtful consideration during this time. However, tragedy struck when Jack suddenly fell ill and passed away. Kevin and I rushed to the hospital, but we arrived too late. "Dad," Kevin exclaimed in disbelief, his voice breaking with grief. Jack's death hit him hard, and Susan was visibly distraught too, crying out, "How could you leave me like this?" Despite my strained relationship with Susan, I couldn't help but feel a profound sympathy for her loss. At that moment, I couldn't help but empathize with Susan's profound grief. We mourned the loss of Jack together, a man who had always shown me nothing but kindness. In the days that followed, Kevin and I found ourselves deeply involved in the funeral arrangements while navigating our sadness. Kevin took the lead in organizing the proceedings, and I did everything I could to support him during this challenging period. The funeral went smoothly, and it felt like we had given Jack a fitting send-off. Gradually, life began to return to its usual rhythm for Kevin and me. It took some time, but we eventually adjusted to life without Jack. Kevin seemed particularly determined to move forward with a renewed sense of purpose. However, just as we were finding our new normal, an unexpected challenge appeared. "Kevin, please, I need help," Susan said as she suddenly showed up at our doorstep, catching us off guard. "Mom, what's wrong?" Kevin asked, clearly disturbed by her uncharacteristic demeanor. Her voice softened as she replied, "Since your father passed, I've been feeling terribly lonely. Nothing seems to taste right anymore. I just wanted to see the faces of my only family, my son and his wife." Her words struck a chord. Her vulnerability was palpable. "Could I stay with you for a little while?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. Kevin and I were taken aback by her request. "I feel like I'll be crushed by loneliness if things continue this way," she pleaded. We hesitated but reasoned that a short stay might not be harmful. Susan seemed so fragile, and we doubted she had the energy to be hostile towards me. Thus, we agreed to let her stay. Surprisingly, Susan adapted well. She even began to help with household chores. "Staying in your home is the least I can do." "Thank you, you're lifesavers," she expressed gratefully. Both Kevin and I appreciated her efforts, and life seemed manageable, almost pleasant. However, after about 5 months, Susan slowly began to revert to her old habits. "Michelle, aren't you planning to quit your job? Isn't it normal for wives to stop working?" she casually remarked one day, signaling a return to her previous ways. "You've been working all this time," I began, but Susan's tone quickly grew harsher, a clear sign she was reverting to her old self. Turning to Kevin, I said, "Okay, we need to talk to Mom and ask her to consider moving back to her hometown." When Kevin broached the subject with Susan, her response took us by surprise. "I've already sold the family home," she confessed. Kevin and I exchanged shocked glances. "Mom, why would you do that without discussing it with us?" "That's our family home. I inherited it from Dad," Kevin said, disbelief coloring his voice. "Selling it was my decision." Susan defended herself, but her casual dismissal stung. "You should have at least informed us," Kevin countered, his frustration evident. "I forgot, sorry. Now I have nowhere else to go, so please don't kick me out," Susan pleaded. Kevin and I were left speechless, struggling to digest this new reality. As we were trying to come to terms with the situation, another unexpected development occurred. I discovered I was pregnant. Kevin and I were overjoyed. We had been hoping for a child, but were almost ready to give up due to our age. This was truly wonderful news. However, the joy of our growing family was tempered by the prospect of dealing with Susan during the pregnancy. Her complaints had resumed. "Why do I have to cook for you too?" "I'm only staying here because of Kevin, not you." "Traditionally, it's the wife who handles all the housework," Kevin explained. While Susan would cook only for herself and him and do her laundry, she stubbornly avoided any chores related to me. Despite Kevin's reprimands, she showed remorse only temporarily before slipping back into old habits. At my wit's end and feeling the need for a break, I decided to start my maternity leave early and return to my parents' home for some peace. When I discussed this with Kevin, he suggested a solution we both eventually agreed upon. As we made our plans, I informed Susan about our decision and began preparing for the move. "You're going back home to give birth?" she asked, a sharp edge to her voice. "Yes, I believe it's the best decision for safer childbirth, and it also means I'll be leaving household duties behind for a while." "Kevin supports this decision," I explained. Upon hearing this, Susan smirked disdainfully. "Why not just stay at your parents' house forever? I don't want to see your parasitic face around here anyway. I bet even Kevin has had enough of you. You don't need to come back to this house anymore," she sneered. Her harsh words surprisingly brought me a sense of relief. All right then, take care, I replied calmly and returned to my parents' house. They welcomed me with open arms, providing the peace and comfort I needed during this time. A month later, Kevin came to my parents' house with exciting news. I finally got the green light from work to transition to remote work permanently, and I found us a new place to live, he announced. That's fantastic, I exclaimed thoughtfully. Kevin had rented an apartment close to my parents' home, making it easier for us to start our new life there. He then terminated the lease on the room Susan had been staying in and finalized our move to the new apartment. Susan was clearly unsettled by these developments and called me in a panic. "Hey, Michelle, where are you?" "I'm at our new place with Kevin," I responded. "New place? Where?" Susan's voice sounded urgent and somewhat panicked. "I'll let you know in time, but I have to be honest. The lease here is being canceled, and everything's being moved out." "I can't stay here anymore," I explained calmly, emphasizing the fresh start Kevin and I were making. "Kevin said he's cutting ties with me." "He doesn't want to talk to me anymore?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Yes, we're starting fresh somewhere else," I added, trying to make her understand the finality of our decision. "So you were just pretending to be nice to stay here, huh? This was your plan all along." Susan accused me of misunderstanding my intentions. "Because you couldn't make any money from selling the house you got from Jack, right?" "How did you find out?" I asked, surprised by her knowledge. "You were telling the neighbors how frustrated you were that the house your husband left had no value. Then suddenly it was up for sale. People just can't keep quiet about things like that. Give me Kevin back. I'm that kid's parent, so I have the right to live with him. As I said before, he doesn't want to see you, and I won't pressure him into something he's uncomfortable with," I responded calmly. Upon hearing this, Susan's temper flared. "Who do you think you are, acting all high and mighty when you're just a broke, freeloading plain wife? That's not a nice thing to say." "But it's true," she snapped. I calmly said, "Well, I don't think our paths will cross much in the future, so it doesn't concern me. But let me be clear. I have a side gig in addition to my full-time job, and I actually make more money than Kevin," I said. "Oh, really? What is this side project?" Susan questioned with skepticism. "Since I first learned web design, I've been taking on initiatives related to that industry." I said, "My monthly income from both my full-time job and freelancing is roughly $10,000. "How come? That much? That exceeds what Jack used to produce." Susan was shocked by my financial circumstances. She obviously had no idea that the woman she had misjudged was making so much money. "But this is all of no significance to you." I firmly stated, "Kevin has severed relations with you, and I'll be removing myself even further." "Hold on. Maybe you could help me out if you're making that amount of money," Susan said wistfully. I made no hesitation. I blocked her number and hung up. Knowing Susan's genuine motivations and making her feel guilty was a comfort. I felt at ease knowing that I wouldn't have to deal with her ever again. Susan had no idea what was going on in our life anymore. She was unaware of my parents' residence or my place of employment. Kevin worked from home, so we were hiding our new address, so there was very little possibility she would locate us. Through rumors, we discovered that Jack had left behind very little in the way of inheritance, and Susan had a history of excessive spending. Her financial troubles were made worse by the fact that she had attempted to sell the house, but had only gotten lowball offers. Her old behaviors were still there in spite of these difficulties. Kevin was called by a neighbor from our previous neighborhood who informed him that Susan's spending patterns remained the same. Her heavy reliance on payday loans has caused her debt to spiral out of control. Her financial problems grew worse when she even tried to approach her neighbors for loans, but she was unsuccessful in doing so. It seems as though she was finally being dealt with by karma. Kevin and I, meantime, were leading a contented existence, happily free from Susan's interruptions. We divided our time between my parents' house and our own as we were ready for our baby to arrive. We were thrilled about the future and looked forward to raising our family and savoring every second we had together with the baby on the way. Knowing the mayhem that had formerly encircled us, we truly valued this newfound quiet. "I'm just going to use the restroom before we leave," I said, grabbing my purse with my phone and documents inside. I stepped off the train, feeling the cool air of the platform on my face. I stood there watching as the train's doors closed, as the whistle blew, and as it slowly began to pull away from the station. My phone buzzed in my purse, snapping me out of my thoughts. Scott's name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. "Nancy, where are you?" Scott's panicked voice came through. "We're not on the same path anymore, Scott," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm divorcing you." I hung up before he could respond. My hand shook as I opened my banking app and blocked Scott's access to our joint account. Barely a minute passed before my phone rang again. This time, it was Janet. I held the phone away from my ear as she shouted insults and threats, demanding that I pay for their trip and compensate them for emotional distress. When she finally paused for breath, I spoke calmly. "Janet, I'm not afraid of your threat. If you post any slander, I won't hesitate to take legal action." I blocked her number, then Scott's, and finally Larry's, just to be sure. Taking a deep breath, I called a cab and went home. The weekend passed in a blur of emotions and practical tasks. I packed Scott's belongings, contacted a lawyer, and drafted the divorce papers. By Friday morning, I felt drained but determined. The sound of a key turning in the lock made me tense. Scott walked in looking disheveled and desperate. "Nancy, please," he said, walking toward me with open arms. I stepped back, pointing to the suitcases by the door. "Your things are packed. It's time for you to go." His expression twisted. "You're not saying that." With a frantic tone, Scott declared, "I've learned my lesson." On the vacation, my mom and I got into a heated argument. I told them that I would no longer be paying for them. Even today, I'm not speaking with them. Please give me another opportunity. I gave him the divorce papers while shaking my head. "Scott, it's too late. This has more to do with respect, trust, and the life I want to lead than it does with your parents. Our desires may differ, and that's acceptable, but I'm at my limit now." Scott nodded after a drawn-out silence, his shoulders lowering in surrender. With a gentle click, he closed the door behind him as he scooped up his luggage and left. The weeks that followed were difficult, but they were also liberating. Thanks to my meticulous documentation and Scott's acceptance of the circumstances, the divorce procedure was completed without incident. I lost myself in my profession, turning to writing and cooking for solace. After everything calmed down, I discovered that I was alone once more, but not in the way I had dreaded. I once again found delight in the small things, like experimenting with new dishes, relaxing on quiet evenings with a good book, and interacting with my followers without feeling obligated to meet anyone's expectations. I had a glass of wine on my balcony one evening and enjoyed the view of the city. I couldn't resist grinning. Although my life hadn't gone as I had hoped, perhaps it had worked out perfectly. Isabella was myself again, a culinary critic, a writer, and most of all, a woman in charge of her own life. "Are you ready to leave yet?" I said as I cast a quick glance around the almost empty room. A sigh came out of my friend. With a hint of relaxation in their voice, they said, "Just waiting on the movers." To be honest, I won't miss you around, and it was a bit much the way you changed the locks, as if I was going to try to break in. The question of why such drastic measures were required had always intrigued me, but it now seemed almost unimportant. Kevin was a reserved man who was constantly worried about what other people thought when we first met. He was the perfect example of a henpecked spouse after being married. I had moved into my new place for a week when Kevin seemed desperate. "It's me. Open up," he asked. I pretended not to see him, reacting to his fear with an act of deceit. "I'm Carol, a 34-year-old who works 4 days a week as a part-time employee. 3 years have passed since Kevin and I exchanged vows. Even if we are childless, I think we may still be happy together. When we first got married, we used to talk about our future goals till the wee hours of the morning. We were both cautious at first, inexperienced in love, but I felt that we genuinely enjoyed one another's presence. One night I said to myself, let's be that couple that grows old together. Yes, that's a good concept. A boy and a girl, maybe 3 children. He concurred, saying, that's exactly what I was thinking. Even for someone who wasn't very interested in dating or marriage, these light-hearted conversations were enjoyable. It was a surprise to meet Kevin. We first spoke at a gathering that I went to out of duty rather than excitement. We grew closer as a result of our mutual indifference and the fact that he appeared to be there on similar pretenses. I considered him extremely charming at the time since he was serious, a little reserved, and always kind to me. Then he made an unexpected proposal. "Will you marry me, Carol? My goal is to see you smile." "How come? We're not even dating yet. Is that correct?" He firmly accepted his suggestion. His surprise inquiry didn't make me turn away. Rather, it got me thinking about the prospect of spending a lifetime with him. "Yes, I accept if that's okay with you." His happiness was contagious, and I suddenly saw why life occasionally deals us these unanticipated, unfortunate turns. I really thought that marrying Kevin would result in a happy future when he proposed. We married within 2 months of our initial meeting, indicating that we jumped right into marriage. Our trip was a little awkward at times due to our lack of romantic experience, but that just made it more exciting. But after moving in together, approximately a month in, I started to see a clear disconnect between my expectations and our marriage's reality. Kevin once came up to me with a more serious than normal expression. He continued earnestly, "Carol, there's something I need to discuss." When he suggested that I think about giving up my work to become a stay-at-home mom, I was shocked. He had never before voiced any displeasure with my work, so this request came as a surprise and signaled the start of an odd change in his conduct. "Why would you ask that?" I questioned, puzzled by his sudden change. "When you work, it makes me feel unneeded," he confessed. "Did someone suggest that to you?" I asked, trying to understand his sudden insecurity. "No, but at my company, all the other men's wives stay at home. It's just how things are there," he explained. I had been clear from the start of our marriage that I intended to keep working, especially since saving money was crucial for our plans. Kevin's new insistence baffled me. But we agreed I would continue working after we got married, didn't we? I reminded him. "I know, but as my wife, I hoped you'd consider my feelings." He responded, his concern more about fitting social norms than our mutual happiness. "Why not just pretend I've quit? There's no need for me actually to leave my job," I suggested, expressing my reluctance to give up my career. However, Kevin seemed increasingly worried about how others perceived him. "If things don't change, I'll be ridiculed by my colleagues and bosses. I'm supposed to be the head of this household, aren't I?" "Please just do as I ask," he pressed, unwilling to listen to my reasoning. "I can't make such a decision immediately." "Let me think about it," I said, needing time to weigh my options. "All right, but please decide soon," he urged, his tone urgent. I knew I couldn't let this issue drag on, fearing what might follow if I didn't act decisively. Seeking advice, I turned to my boss, Madison. She had worked as an administrative assistant since high school and had faced a similar situation with a controlling ex-husband, eventually leading to her divorce. Now she was a dedicated single mother and someone I greatly admired. That must have been tough, I mused, considering divorce as I reflected on her strength and resilience. Navigating the early days of our marriage, Kevin and I found ourselves at a complex juncture. "It's tricky since we're newlyweds," I pondered, contemplating the implications of quitting my job. "I haven't fully thought this through, but leaving my position will make it difficult to find a replacement." I shared my concerns with Madison, my boss, who had become a mentor to me. "I don't plan to quit immediately," I explained. "I'm looking for a way to keep working if possible. Perhaps we could maintain my current part-time schedule for the time being. Switching to full-time might draw too much attention." "That's a wise approach," Madison agreed, supportive of my decision to negotiate with Kevin. "If he still objects, we could propose reducing my hours officially to part-time." "That sounds like a sensible plan. Remember, you can always count on me for advice. I'm here to support you," Madison reassured me, offering a lifeline in the turbulent sea of my marital issues. "Thank you, I appreciate your support," I replied, grateful for her guidance. Our conversation deepened, and I discovered that Madison's ex-husband had also changed drastically after their marriage, a situation eerily similar to mine. This revelation was eye-opening. I hadn't considered that some men might transform so completely after marriage, becoming almost unrecognizable from the person they once were. Viewing my circumstances through this lens, I wondered if I had been misled. Despite numerous discussions, Kevin and I were at an impasse. Isn't it a woman's role after marriage to support her husband and manage the household? He argued, clinging to outdated norms. "What era are you living in? Nowadays, it's common for both spouses to work," I countered, shocked by his archaic views. "Maybe for other couples, but we're different. You see that, don't you?" He tried to persuade me. "I understand where you're coming from, but I can't agree with it." I stood my ground, asking him to consider my perspective. Kevin persisted daily, pressuring me to quit my job. Despite his efforts, they fell short. I consulted with Madison and decided to resign officially. However, in reality, I continued working part-time 4 days a week. Thankfully, Madison was sympathetic to my situation and agreed to reduce my hours. "I've resigned from my job at the company, just as you wanted," I told Kevin. "Really? Thank you. Now I can feel more secure about my position at work," he responded, relieved yet oblivious to the truth. By then, it was clear Kevin was primarily concerned with how others perceived him. His abrupt transformation left me bewildered. I chose to deceive him, continuing to work secretly in hopes of preserving our relationship and my independence. But I soon realized that my hopes for a fresh start were misplaced. Despite our new beginning, Kevin continued to exert his dominance and vent his frustrations on me. One day, he sprung a sudden request on me. "A junior colleague is coming over today. I need you to host," he said abruptly. I had no idea. I responded, caught off guard. "Sorry, it was a last-minute decision. Just keep it simple, please," he instructed. Determined to fulfill the request, I prepared drinks and snacks for the guests. However, when Kevin arrived, he was displeased. "Didn't I ask you to prepare for today?" he chided. "You mentioned just keeping it basic, and you took that literally." This reflects poorly on me. I need you to fulfill your role as a wife properly. What exactly does that mean? I did my best. Is there an issue with what I prepared? I asked, genuinely confused by his dissatisfaction. No, not really, he muttered, his expression unreadable, a stark contrast to the person I once knew. From then on, Kevin began inviting guests over almost every week. While he reveled in the social gatherings, he expected me to be on standby, prepared for anything. It seemed he was trying to impress everyone with his capabilities as a husband. Kevin, having guests over every week seems excessive, I ventured one day. No, it's fine. Everyone enjoys it, and you should support my decisions. It's your duty as my wife. But maintaining such a lifestyle was also expensive. How exactly am I supposed to manage it? I asked. Oh, stop complaining. He would dismiss any question I had as nagging and avoided giving a direct answer. Every morning, I woke up early to prepare meals, make lunch sandwiches, and see Kevin off, all while keeping his suit ready for the day. On days I worked part-time, from 9 o'clock a.m. to 2 o'clock p.m., there was barely any time to rest. Despite the business, I cherished my job. Working often felt like a welcome respite. Carol, you seem tired lately. Are you okay? My coworker Deborah asked one day, noticing my fatigue. Yeah, a bit actually, I admitted. Let me know if there's anything I can do. I'm here to help in any way I can. Thank you, Deborah. You've been such a reliable support, unlike Kevin. Deborah understood the deterioration in how I was being treated. She was aware of my secret part-time job and had kept it hidden from Kevin. I appreciate everything, Deborah. I expressed my gratitude. Bill mentioned it, but I never imagined Kevin would behave like this, she confessed. Neither did I. I've tried talking to him, but he won't listen, and we hardly have a meaningful conversation anymore. I'm sorry. If only I were stronger. I sighed, feeling overwhelmed. Don't be too hard on yourself. You're managing work and household tasks admirably. I appreciate all your help. I'm glad to hear that, I replied, grateful for her kindness. Living with Deborah's support had been nothing but a positive experience for me, a stark contrast to the strain at home. However, Kevin seemed uncomfortable with how close Deborah and I had become. This discomfort led him to make a shocking and sudden decision. Where's Deborah? Mom's gone, I questioned, puzzled by her absence. What do you mean, gone? I asked, my confusion growing. Mom's getting older, and I thought it would be best for her to be in a facility, he replied nonchalantly. You actually placed her in a home? My voice cracked, barely hiding my disbelief. Yeah, just finished settling her into the new place. Now I have the house to myself, he stated as if he had just completed a routine chore. I was at my parents' home when this happened, and the fact that he unilaterally decided to place his mother in a facility shocked me. She was older, yes, but not to the extent that she required full-time care. It became clear to me that he had sent Deborah away to have the house to himself. When I visited Deborah at the facility, she looked surprised yet resigned. I'm sorry it had to come to this. I apologized. No, it's not your fault, Deborah reassured me. I never expected him to go to such lengths. I'm afraid of what he might do if I resist. I'll miss you, but I'll manage. If you need anything, you're always welcome here, she added, trying to offer some comfort. Thank you, I replied, feeling the weight of the situation. Afterward, we moved from our previous home into my in-laws' house. Despite managing the household diligently, Kevin never acknowledged my efforts or showed any gratitude. The idea of having children, once a topic of eager discussion, now seemed completely out of reach. Kevin often disregarded me, preferring to spend his time away from home. Additionally, he began imposing arbitrary rules. No matter how late he returned, I was required to stay awake until his arrival. If I happened to wake up later than him in the morning, he would become upset. "What time will you be home today?" I asked one evening. "I'm not sure. Just stay up until I get back, okay?" he instructed. One day, after a similar exchange, when Kevin returned home, I noticed something unusual. As I took his suit to hang it up, the air was fragrant, a sweet feminine scent that was unfamiliar to me, as I didn't wear perfume. It was unmistakable evidence of an affair. Whenever he came home late, I would catch whiffs of the same perfume. That day, he unusually suggested I go to bed before him, raising my suspicions even further. Quietly, I went to the living room and overheard their conversation. "Oh, she's clueless." "When are you going to leave her?" a woman's voice asked. "I'll kick her out soon enough," Kevin's voice responded. Clearly, their voices carried easily, especially the woman's, which was quite loud. From their discussion, it was evident that their relationship had been ongoing for some time. While the incident with the perfume didn't shock me, it left me feeling utterly disgusted. Kevin was still technically my husband, and despite my hopes for a turnaround, his treatment of me remained harsh and unchanging. As we approached the 3-year mark of our marriage, he sprung another surprise. "I have a business trip the day after tomorrow. I need you to get everything ready," he announced abruptly. "That's very short notice," I replied, the timing and suddenness raising my suspicions. "I'll be away for about 4 days. Please make sure my clothes are prepared." I couldn't help but suspect his claim of a business trip was a cover for time spent with his mistress. I remembered a conversation with a colleague's wife at a company gathering who had warned me, "Be cautious if he suddenly mentions a business trip. Our company doesn't even have those." Her words echoed in my mind as I pieced things together. My suspicions had been confirmed earlier when I found a chat on his mobile phone, accidentally left in the living room, detailing how he had taken paid leave for this so-called trip. This discovery marked a turning point for me and signaled the beginning of the end of our marriage. Armed with proof of his affair, I prepared to confront him with divorce papers upon his return. However, it was Kevin who made the first move. "Are you ready to leave? The movers will be here soon," he said coldly as soon as he returned home. "I need you to be gone before I get back," he demanded. "Why are you saying this all of a sudden?" I countered, shocked by his blunt directive. "You can't spring this on me and expect me to leave immediately." "Then I'll wait a bit, but start preparing to leave," he replied, dismissing my objections. "Goodbye." I never imagined that my once timid, overly concerned husband would transform into such a domineering partner, but this was the final straw. The future I once envisioned with him now felt like a distant memory. Living with such a man, I couldn't envision a bright future ahead. What comes next? I wondered aloud. This could get interesting. Has the mover arrived yet? "No need to rush. They should be here soon," came the reply. "Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, I'm changing the locks on the house," he added almost casually. "All right, got it," I responded, my heart sinking. "The thought of not having to see your face again is a relief," were his parting words. After nearly 3 years of marriage, convinced our relationship was irreversibly over, I swiftly left the premises. Soon after, I instructed my lawyer to file for divorce. Despite our circumstances, my husband boldly posted pictures with his mistress on social media, an act of brazen audacity. How could he be so reckless, not realizing he was providing even more evidence of his affair? Even our mutual friends noticed his strange behavior, marking the public unraveling of what we once shared. After leaving my in-laws' home, I transitioned back to full-time work and moved into a high-rise apartment in the suburbs, a place I had long dreamed of living. The apartment was spacious, ideal for one, and felt wonderfully liberating without Kevin's presence. About a month after settling in, I was jolted one morning by the doorbell. Peering through the monitor, I was stunned to see Kevin standing outside. "Hey, it's me, Kevin." "Open up, Carol," he called out, his voice presumptuous and demanding. His sudden appearance and the entitlement in his tone were beyond my comprehension. Deciding to feign ignorance, I thought it might be more amusing than outright rejecting him. Who are you?" "I'm sorry, but I don't know you," I responded through the intercom. "Don't tell me you've forgotten your husband's face." "I'm not married. I think you've mistaken me for someone else." I continued watching as desperation seemed to wash over him, his face a shadow of the timid man I once knew. "Please just listen. I've been deceived and I need Carol's help," he pleaded. "I'm sorry, but I'm not obligated to assist you. If you persist, I'll have to call the police." "Seriously, after all, I don't know you," I retorted, steadfast in my resolve to treat him as a stranger. Kevin must have thought I would always be there to solve his problems, but I was no longer the person who tolerated such dependency. Yet he remained stubborn, unwilling to relent. "That's it. You made this mess, so it's up to you to fix it." "You don't have to be so tough on me," he whimpered. "Oh, and by the way, you can't stay at your parents' place anymore," he added abruptly. "What do you mean? Do you know whose name the house is under?" I questioned, surprised by his statement. "No, but it used to belong to Deborah." "No, it's in my name," I explained, revealing a significant change he was unaware of. Kevin had insisted I leave when I confided in Deborah, which visibly upset and disappointed her. "I can't believe my son has turned out like this. I'm truly sorry, especially after all the help you've given us," Deborah had said during one of our conversations. "Deborah, you're divorcing Kevin, aren't you?" she had asked. "Yes, it's for the best," I confirmed. "In that case, I'll transfer the house to you," she offered, making a decision that took both me and presumably Kevin by surprise. I have always been more alone. My name is Isabella, and I've always been adept at keeping myself occupied, even as a child. It's not like I'm antisocial or anything. I simply prefer spending most of my time alone. Thank heavens, my mother saw early on that I preferred to be on my own. Rather than attempting to alter me, she positively supported it. When I was barely tall enough to reach the kitchen counter, she introduced me to cooking. I absorbed everything like a sponge. Mom taught me how to truly understand food, not just how to cook. She would walk me through each meal at the cafes and restaurants we would visit throughout town. My passion for eating only deepened as I grew older. I discovered that food was about more than simply flavor and texture when I began reading articles by well-known restaurant critics. It was also about presentation and the whole ambience of the establishment. I told my mother one day that I wanted to write a book about cuisine. "So you better learn everything there is to know about it, Emma," she remarked with a pleased expression on her face. I thus took that action. I went to culinary school to become a master chef. After earning my degree, I continued on. I enrolled in journalism classes to hone my writing skills. I wanted my words to give readers the impression that they were actually tasting the dish. I began reviewing restaurants for a tiny local newspaper as a food reviewer. I described how the handmade pasta melted in my mouth and how the fragrance of garlic and basil transported me to a Tuscan kitchen in my post on a small American restaurant. I was surprised that it was well liked. The next day, my editor gave me a call and told me, Kid, you have a gift. Continue like this, and you'll succeed. I realized then that I had found my calling. I developed a reputation for writing frank and entertaining reviews while working for several newspapers and publications. When I created my own social media profiles, things really started to shift. All of a sudden, I was interacting with foodies worldwide and wasn't only writing for publications. My fan base developed, and they were constantly curious to hear my opinions on the newest culinary fads and little-known eateries. I was seated at a nice table at the Rustic Spoon, a brand-new farm-to-table restaurant, one evening taking notes for my review. I spotted an older couple at the adjacent table staring at me while I wrote about the ambience. The woman was gazing at me and speaking to her husband. I returned to my notepad, grinning graciously, having become accustomed to being recognized. I heard her voice suddenly. It was enthusiastic and pleasant. "Pardon me, are you Isabella Sermon?" "The culinary expert." I said, "That's me. Nice to meet you," nodding. "Oh, I'm so a fan," she said. "All of your posts are followed. Do you want to have supper with us?" I wavered. Usually, I prefer to eat by myself while working, but their sincere excitement caused me to reconsider. I then seated myself at their table. The woman identified her husband as Larry and herself as Janet before pointing to a young man I had previously seen. "And this is Scott, our son," she said. With a smile, Scott raised his head from his phone. He grinned and said, "Hey, nice to meet you." We struck up a casual discussion right away. Janet and Larry were really interested in hearing about my recent adventures, and Scott was often adding hilarious comments that made me laugh even when I wasn't laughing. I discovered that I was enjoying their company more than I had anticipated as the evening wore on. In particular, Scott was a pleasure to speak with. It turned out we were both big fans of independent movies and corny jokes. Scott, who appeared a little hesitant, said, "Hey, would it be okay if I got your number?" when it came time to depart. You know, in case I need suggestions for a restaurant or anything else. My stomach had a slight flutter that was unrelated to the eating. "Okay," I said, "for restaurant suggestions." That following evening, we exchanged texts. We were chatting about everything at first, but initially it was just about food and restaurants. Our talks turned into the most enjoyable part of my day. When Scott asked me out on a genuine date a month later, I readily accepted. We went to a funky small cafe that I had been eager to explore for our first date. As I sat across from him, I became aware of how at ease I was. The discomfort I generally anticipated on first dates wasn't there. Scott proposed a year after we first met. He knew I wasn't into large, showy events, so it wasn't a huge deal. Rather, he prepared me supper, an effort at something sweet that resulted in lumpy mashed potatoes and a little charred steak, and asked me to marry him over dessert. I mean, how could I refuse that? After the wedding, we moved into my apartment. We were practical about our finances, creating a joint account for shared expenses. Since I earned more, I contributed more, but we both felt it was fair. Living together revealed new things about Scott. He had a habit of leaving dishes in the sink, his clothes scattered everywhere, and his toothpaste tube always uncapped. Coffee mugs seemed to multiply on every surface. I bit my tongue, reminding myself that I wasn't perfect either. It's just an adjustment period, I told myself. We'll find our rhythm, and slowly we did. Scott started making more of an effort to clean up, and I learned to relax my standards a bit. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. 5 months later, it was time for our first vacation together. Standing in the airport with our luggage, I felt a wave of excitement. I turned to Scott, ready to share my joy, but noticed his eyes were fixed on something behind me. I turned around and saw Janet and Larry walking toward us with big smiles. They only had small carry-on bags, like they were going on a short trip instead of a week-long vacation. "Surprise," Janet said, hugging Scott. "We couldn't let you three lovebirds have all the fun, could we?" My heart sank. This wasn't part of the plan. I looked at Scott, hoping he would explain, but he avoided eye contact. "It's kind of a family tradition," he muttered. "We always vacation together." I forced a smile, hiding my disappointment. "How nice," I managed to say. "But don't you need more luggage for a week-long trip?" Larry waved it off. "Oh, we'll just buy what we need when we get there. No sense in dragging heavy suitcases around, right?" The first few days of the vacation were a blur. I focused on the positives, the beautiful scenery, the interesting new foods I discovered, and the locals' warm hospitality. But as the days went by, I started to notice how much Janet and Larry spent. They shopped like there was no tomorrow, ate at the fanciest restaurants, and never seemed to worry about the bill. One evening, as we sat at another expensive restaurant, I couldn't hold back my curiosity any longer. I leaned over to Scott and whispered, "How can your parents afford all this? Aren't they retired?" Scott looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. "They're just good with money," he muttered, suddenly very interested in the menu. I wanted to ask more, but at that moment, Janet began telling a story about her bridge club, putting an end to our conversation. As the vacation came to an end, I found myself eager to go home. The day after we returned, I decided to check our joint account, curious to see how much we had spent. When I logged in, my eyes went wide in shock. The balance was much lower than I expected, alarmingly low. "Scott, can you come here for a minute?" I called, my voice tense. I turned the screen toward him. "Care to explain this?" Scott's face went pale as he looked at the numbers. "I might have used our account to cover some of Mom and Dad's expenses," Scott admitted quietly. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger under control. "Scott, that was our money, and I contributed most of it. You should have talked to me first." I know," he said, reaching for my hand. "I'm sorry, Nancy. It won't happen again." "I promise." A month went by, and things slowly got back to normal. Scott kept his word and didn't touch our joint account without discussing it with me first. I tried to let go of what happened during the vacation and focused on my work and our life together. One cool autumn evening, Scott came home looking excited. "Hey, Nancy," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I stood at the kitchen counter cutting vegetables for dinner. "I've got an idea. How about we go on an overnight picnic this weekend, just the two of us? A rented motorhome and the great outdoors. What do you say?" The idea sounded great, and we spent the next few days getting ready for our little adventure. I packed a cooler with gourmet sandwiches, homemade potato salad, and a bottle of wine. Scott took care of renting a small motor home and planning our route. We arrived at the campsite in the afternoon. The place was beautiful, surrounded by tall pine trees and a clear lake. Scott parked the motor home in our spot, and we stepped outside to enjoy the fresh air. That's when I saw a familiar car pulling into the space next to ours. Janet and Larry got out, waving excitedly. "Surprise," Janet called out. "We thought we'd join you on your little getaway." I turned to Scott, hoping to see the same shock I felt on his face, but instead he looked sheepish, avoiding my eyes. "Scott," I said, my voice calm but firm, "did you tell them about our trip?" Before Scott could answer, Janet came over and hugged me tightly. "Isn't this exciting? A family camping trip." I forced a smile, but I couldn't help noticing they showed up with no supplies, no tent, no food, not even a change of clothes. As the evening went on, it was clear that our romantic getaway had turned into a family event. Janet and Larry took over the conversation, telling us stories about their past camping trips. They also helped themselves to our food and wine, leaving barely enough for Scott and me. When it was time to sleep, another issue came up. Our small motorhome wasn't built for 5 people. Scott turned to his mother and said, "You and Dad can take the bedroom. Nancy and I will figure something out in the car." So instead of enjoying a cozy night together in the motorhome, I found myself uncomfortably curled up in the back seat of our car while Scott snored softly in the front. The next morning, with blurry eyes and feeling stiff from our awkward sleeping arrangements, I suggested to Scott that we cut the trip short. The drive home was tense, filled with awkward small talk and long periods of silence. As soon as we arrived back at our apartment, Scott's parents said a cheerful goodbye, completely unaware of the strain their presence had caused. Once they were gone, I turned to Scott. "We need to talk about this," I said firmly. He nodded, looking resigned. "I know. I'm sorry, Nancy. I should have told you they were coming." "It's not just that," I sighed. "It's about boundaries. Scott, your parents can't keep showing up in our lives like this. We need to set some ground rules." Scott nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll talk to them." A few days after we returned, I was in the kitchen testing a new recipe when the doorbell rang. To my surprise, Janet and Larry were standing there with bright smiles, as if the vacation mess had never happened. "Isabella, dear," Janet exclaimed, giving me a quick hug as they walked in. "We need your expertise. We were wondering if you could tell us which restaurants in the city have the most delicious food." I was caught off guard by the question. "Well," I said, "there are quite a few great places. The French bistro downtown is fantastic, and Sakura Sushi and Thai cuisine on 3rd Avenue has some of the best sushi I've ever had." "Why do you ask?" Janet's eyes lit up with excitement. "Oh, we thought we'd keep an eye out for any open events at these restaurants, so we can go and eat for free." I turned to Scott, who had just walked into the room, hoping he would back me up. But he just shrugged and said, "Come on, Nancy. You've got to accept my parents as they are. No use trying to change them." I was speechless. This felt like crossing a line, didn't it? But before I could respond, Janet and Larry thanked me and left, happily chatting about their plans to get free meals. A few days later, I was preparing for a review of a new upscale American restaurant, Band 8. As usual, I posted the details of my visit on social media, letting my followers know when and where they could expect my next review. That evening, I arrived at Band 8, settled into my table with my notebook in hand, ready to experience and evaluate the menu. I had just opened the wine list when I heard a familiar voice. "Well, hello there." I looked up and saw Janet and Larry smiling as they sat down at my table without asking. My heart sank. Janet picked up a menu and announced loudly, "I'm Isabella's mother-in-law, We're here to enjoy the free meal with her." I felt my face heat up with embarrassment. "Janet," I whispered, "please keep your voice down. I'm here to work. You can't just show up like this." But Janet wasn't listening. She raised her voice even more. "Oh, don't be silly, dear. Everyone knows food critics eat for free. Why shouldn't your family enjoy the perks too? We have every right to be here." I could feel the eyes of other diners on us, and the head waiter was walking toward our table, looking concerned. This was getting out of control fast. "Janet, Larry," I said firmly but quietly, "this is your last warning. If you don't leave right now, I'll have no choice but to call security. You're interrupting my work and causing a scene." Janet's face twisted with anger. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Well, I never," she shouted. Is this how you treat family, Isabella? As she grabbed her purse, she turned to me one last time, her voice full of disappointment. You know, I think I made a big mistake. I'm the one who told Scott to marry you. I followed your Facebook page and thought, now there's a girl who could help us enjoy the finer things in life. I thought you'd take us to fancy restaurants for free, maybe even help us out a little. But I was wrong. If this is how you treat family, well, we're not interested in being part of yours anymore. With that, Janet stormed out of the restaurant, Larry following behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone and dialed Scott's number. He answered on the third ring. Scott, I said, my voice barely a whisper, is it true? Did your mother really push you to marry me because she thought I'd provide for them? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Scott sighed. Yes, he admitted. Mom saw your success and thought, well, you know how she is. She insisted you be perfect for me, for us. It felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. I hung up the phone and turned to the head waiter, who had been standing nearby. I'm really sorry for the disturbance, I said. I won't be able to finish my review tonight. Please give my apologies to the chef. As I gathered my things, I pulled out my phone again and quickly typed a message to my followers, explaining that due to unexpected events, my review of Barty Santa would be postponed. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing to make sense of everything that had happened. When I walked through the door of our apartment, Scott was waiting for me, his face full of worry. Nancy, he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. Why didn't you tell me? I asked softly. Was I just a way for your family to get what they wanted? Scott's face fell as he reached for my hand. This time, I didn't pull away. No, Nancy. No, well, yes, it started with my mom's idea. But I fell in love with you. Not your job, not your connections, just you. I sank onto the couch, suddenly feeling drained. Scott sat next to me, his eyes full of hope. I know I've made mistakes, he said quietly. I should have set boundaries with my parents a long time ago. But Nancy, I love you. I want to make this right. Can we try to fix this? I looked at him, really looked at him. Despite everything, I knew I still loved him. As we sat there on the couch, our hands intertwined, I felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could get through this and come out stronger. The next couple of months passed peacefully. Scott worked on setting boundaries with his parents, and I threw myself into my work, trying to rebuild the trust in our relationship. Then the moment I had worked toward for years finally came. My cookbook was published. It was more successful than I ever dreamed. Major newspapers and magazines praised it, and it quickly became a bestseller on all the big online retailers. One evening, as I was scrolling through yet another glowing review, Scott came home with a surprise. Let's celebrate your success, he said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. I've planned a trip to that charming city you've always wanted to visit. It has everything you love. Great restaurants, historical sites, beautiful nature, and I booked us a room at that boutique hotel you've been eyeing. I paused for a moment, then asked the question that had been on my mind. It's just us, right? Your parents aren't coming? Scott looked me straight in the eye. I promise, Nancy, it's just us. No parents, no surprises. The day of our trip arrived, and we made our way to the train station, luggage in hand, feeling hopeful about what was ahead. My heart sank. There they were, Janet and Larry, waving enthusiastically. I turned to Scott, hoping this was just a bad coincidence, but the guilty look on his face told me everything. I'm sorry, he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. I could not invite them. Mom found out about the trip. In that moment, something inside me broke. All the promises, all the efforts of the past months, they meant nothing. But I forced a smile as Janet and Larry approached. I noticed they only had a small purse between them, no luggage. "Where's your luggage?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Janet waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry, dear. You'll handle everything, won't you? After all, we're celebrating your success." As the announcement for boarding came over the loudspeaker, we made our way onto the train. Once everyone settled into their seats, I stood up. "I'm just going to use the restroom before we leave," I said, grabbing my purse with my phone and documents inside. I stepped off the train, feeling the cool air of the platform on my face. I stood there watching as the train doors closed, as the whistle blew, and as it slowly began to pull away from the station. My phone buzzed in my purse, snapping me out of my thoughts. Scott's name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. "Nancy, where are you?" Scott's panicked voice came through. "We're not on the same path anymore, Scott," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm divorcing you." I hung up before he could respond. My hand shook as I opened my banking app and blocked Scott's access to our joint account. Barely a minute passed before my phone rang again. This time, it was Janet. I held the phone away from my ear as she shouted insults and threats, demanding that I pay for their trip and compensate them for emotional distress. When she finally paused for breath, I spoke calmly. "Janet, I'm not afraid of your threat. If you post any slander, I won't hesitate to take legal action." I blocked her number, then Scott's, and finally Larry's, just to be sure. Taking a deep breath, I called a cab and went home. The weekend passed in a blur of emotions and practical tasks. I packed Scott's belongings, contacted a lawyer, and drafted the divorce papers. By Friday morning, I felt drained but determined. The sound of a key turning in the lock made me tense. Scott walked in looking disheveled and desperate. "Nancy, please," he said, walking toward me with open arms. I stepped back, pointing to the suitcases by the door. "Your things are packed. It's time for you to go." His expression twisted. "You're not saying that." With a frantic tone, Scott declared, "I've learned my lesson." On the vacation, my mom and I got into a heated argument. I told them that I would no longer be paying for them. Even today, I'm not speaking with them. Please give me another opportunity. I gave him the divorce papers while shaking my head. "Scott, it's too late. This has more to do with respect, trust, and the life I want to lead than it does with your parents. Our desires may differ, and that's acceptable. But I'm at my limit now." Scott nodded after a drawn-out silence, his shoulders lowering in surrender. With a gentle click, he closed the door behind him as he scooped up his luggage and left. The weeks that followed were difficult, but they were also liberating. Thanks to my meticulous documentation and Scott's acceptance of the circumstances, the divorce procedure was completed without incident. I lost myself in my profession, turning to writing and cooking for solace. After everything calmed down, I discovered that I was alone once more, but not in the way I had dreaded. I once again found delight in the small things, like experimenting with new dishes, relaxing on quiet evenings with a good book, and interacting with my followers without feeling obligated to meet anyone's expectations. I had a glass of wine on my balcony one evening and enjoyed the view of the city. I couldn't resist grinning. Although my life hadn't gone as I had hoped, perhaps it had worked out perfectly. Isabella was myself again, a culinary critic, a writer, and most of all, a woman in charge of her own life.